Go.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Online Trust Alliance's webinar providing highlights of our 2016 IRS free eFile audit and honor roll. My name is Madeline Smith, and I'm from OTA. I'll be your host for this webinar, and I just have a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, I want to point out that we have all attendees on mute to avoid any sound interference, but please feel free to send us questions throughout the webinar using the chat feature. Also, I want to point out that we are recording today's webinar, so you won't have to take notes if you don't want to. We will have the recording available on the OTA site following the session. With me today are Jeff Noakes from Symantec, Flavio Martins of DigiCert, Mike Jones from Agari, and our own Craig Spiesel and Jeff Wilbur from OTA. And with that, just as a very quick overview of OTA itself, I wanted to take a moment to remind everyone who we are and what our mission is. Our mission is to enhance online trust and empower users while promoting innovation and vitality of the internet. To do this, we work to educate and develop and advance best practices and tools. We're a charitable nonprofit. We're supported by a diverse group of organizations from across the globe, and our member companies cover a wide range of business areas. And for those on the call who may be new to OTA, one of our key initiatives is the Online Trust Audit, which is now in its 8th year. The audit is a project that utilizes publicly published, regularly updated, and vetted methodology to examine a wide range of industries in terms of privacy, security, and consumer protection. So today we'll be talking about this online trust audit methodology as it applies to the IRS free eFile sites that we looked at. And with that, I want to turn it over to Craig Spiesel to give us our overview.
Great, Maddie, and thank you. And as Maddie mentioned, we, the Online Trust Alliance, we've been doing these audits for over 8 years, and through a multi-stakeholder process have developed a methodology of consumer protection, security, and privacy practices. But I wanted to really drive into the questions, why are we doing this audit on eFile? And effectively, as the headlines have really shared, is tax time is really Christmas for the cyber criminals. It's a tremendous opportunity for their ability to drive identity theft, account takeover, and related malicious activities. And proof points of that, and if you review the report, we have the data that supports this, but the amount of spoofed and malicious email continues to grow every year. But one of the challenges that we're seeing, and you'll hear Mike Jones and the other panelists talk about, is the precision and the professionalism of these exploits. So it's through email. We're seeing more and more search advertising, lookalike domains. The report shares that in just a month period, we found over 400 lookalike domains purported to come from these eFile companies we've audited and the IRS. And this is just shows the sophistication of the criminals. And then the malicious advertising, malicious ads that appear to be ads from eFile companies. So the criminals are continually trying to attack these legitimate businesses. The other big area that's a concern is account takeovers and ransomware that are targeting tax providers, legal providers, and businesses. So it's not just consumers. And clearly, as we've seen, the IRS and many state agencies have also been under attack. So the net impact is just the impact on consumer trust. And this impact is far beyond just the eFile. It really affects the foundation of trust online and the internet and e-commerce as we know it, and bringing on the demand for more regulations and more oversight. So that's why we care, and want to jump into the honor roll objectives. Consistent with what we've been doing year to year, is our objectives are really about promote best practices. As Maddie says, on our site, we have many resources out there to point organizations to, both in the public and private sector. The other area that we focus a great deal on is about recognizing those companies that are doing the right thing. Our goal in all of our work is to point the light identify North Stars to really recognize companies that are going above and beyond. One of our key points is, and the last point in this slide, is about moving beyond compliance to stewardship. Compliance is a legal term that's just a minimal amount to get by. In today's threat landscape and consumer trust, it's not adequate. And so we need to move beyond compliance to one of stewardship. And ultimately, part of our effort here has been to offer assistance to the IRS, the Free File Alliance, and the sites themselves, raising awareness of what they need to do. And so these are the objectives, and very consistent with what we've been doing year to year in all of the other honor rolls and sectors. A few disclaimers here. Again, we are only reporting on the facts, again, using commonly known and multi-stakeholder methodology. So we're not recommending or endorsing any one organization over the other. Again, our methodology is very sound. It's been through a call for public comments each year. And I should point out the methodology increases, or I should say the criteria changes year to year. In addition, you'll see in here, we actually audited against the IRS's own eFile security mandate that was established through working with industry and many of us on the call here in 2009, in which the IRS said they would be enforcing and taking action on at the end of 2010. And basically, these criteria and concerns really should apply to any service provider. And a business or a consumer should really think twice, should really think about their security practices, their marketing practices, and privacy. Last 2 points is this is a point in time. Our data points were taken over a month ago, and data may have since changed, and as we've observed, has since changed in there. And I should also say that we have reached out to the Free File Alliance to provide them assistance, and to date our emails and phone calls have been unanswered, but we continue to work with other trade organizations. Again, our goal is to promote innovation and consumer trust. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Wilbur, who is the principal analyst on this report, and we'll share a little bit over what we've been doing and the structure of our honor roll program. Jeff?
Great, thanks, Craig. As you can see on this slide, we have covered lots of sectors with our honor roll over the years, and usually in the middle of the year, roughly June, we do an honor roll that covers almost 1,000 websites, top banking sites, top retailers, social sites. You can see the list there. And then we, over the years, have added a few new sectors. Last year we added Internet of Things manufacturers because that's becoming such a big new area. Last fall we audited the 2016 presidential candidates. At that point in time there were 23 of them. And then our most recent audit that we're talking about today of the free eFile tax sites. The way we structure the scoring of this, and this will kind of factor into the remainder of our discussion here today, is there are 3 areas we focus on, which Craig has alluded to: consumer protection, site security, and privacy, kind of the Venn diagram you see there on the right. And in each category you can earn 100 points. And over the years those 100 points kind of shift between different things based on our feedback from the industry. But there's a baseline of 100 points in each of those categories. You can earn bonus points for new emerging practices. You get penalties for things like vulnerabilities, data breaches, and such. And to make it on our honor roll, you have to earn 80% of the total points available, but you have to pass each category. In other words, have 55% or better in each category. If you fail one category, you essentially fail the honor roll. So that's kind of the setup for how we do this. If we look at how the eFile sites compared to the other sectors that we've audited over the last year, you can see that they're near the upper end. 54% achieved honor roll status. The only one higher is the social sites at 58. I think the overall average was somewhere in the low 40s. So on the surface that looks pretty good, and you would expect good practices from companies that are providing such a critical personal information type service such as tax filing. So this is our list of who made the honor roll, and in this case we also show who failed. We typically, if you look at our historical honor rolls, don't really show who didn't make the cut or who actually failed. It's obvious kind of who made the honor roll and who didn't. But usually there's kind of a slice in between of people who had average scores but didn't fail. In this case, because there were only 13 sites and 7 made the honor roll, the other 6 actually had failures in 1 or more categories of the site security, consumer protection, or privacy. So here's the list here. Of the failures, 5 of the sites failed in email authentication. We'll look at this in a second, and 3 failed in site security. So I think there were a couple sites that actually failed in both categories. Let's go on to the next slide, and you can see kind of, if we look at the failure rates here, the eFile sites are on the lower end, which you would expect because they were on the higher end of the honor roll. You can see some of these segments have very high failure rates. And I think the average here, again, was in the high 40s. So if we look inside those failures, I already kind of alluded to it, but there were none in privacy. Those are the bars on the right. You can see that, for instance, the presidential candidates had a very high failure rate in privacy due to their data sharing practices. But the failures for the eFile sites were focused in consumer protection, which is primarily driven by email authentication practices, and then some in site security as well. What we found, and we'll dig into this another layer, but 4 sites had no email authentication at all, and this protects your email from being spoofed by others, so people pretending to be you and sending email out to consumers. And on the site security side, 3 of the sites failed. They had old ciphers or weren't supporting current protocols. So now we're going to do kind of the same format for each of these 3 major buckets. And if we look at consumer protection, the baseline points are driven by email authentication, as I mentioned. There are 2 types that are commonly used out there that are standards. And we're looking for authentication at the top level domain, in other words, company.com, and then any subdomains that get used for email, like email.company.com, because a lot of times companies use multiple domains to send email. We're also looking for what's called DMARCs, records and policies, and Mike Jones will go into this in a little more detail of how these all tie together. The bonus points that are available in this category are TLS for email, which is encrypting the email in transit between the mail servers, so it can't be looked at by someone in the kind of open text. And then also DNSSEC, which is securing your DNS site more thoroughly. And then if you get penalty points if you don't lock your domain. In other words, someone could actually hijack your domain without your permission. So that's penalty points. That's kind of the structure of our scoring here. So let's go on to the next slide. And Mike Jones from Agari, why don't you take over and kind of talk us through these issues?
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So I'm going to focus on the next couple slides primarily on the email authentication and DMARC component of the consumer protection score. So first of all, why should we care about email authentication and in this context? Well, I mean, it's pretty well documented out there in various sources that email is a primary and preferred vector by the criminals of initiating attacks. Whether their ultimate goal is to initiate some kind of financial fraud like a wire transfer or a data breach, or just to steal a consumer's identity, a large portion of these types of attacks all start out with email. And the way the criminals like to do this is by spoofing a trusted identity. So they're going to try to pick someone that you know, that you interact with, that you expect to see communications coming from, and they're going to spoof that identity to try to use that trust to trick the consumer or the employee into giving up some sort of access that initiates these attacks. You can look at things like all the recent news about the wave of business email compromises that are using spoofed identities to spoof a CEO of a company and initiate a wire transfer, or the Verizon data breach report every year talks about how phishing is one of the primary vector into data breaches. But right now we're talking about tax fraud, because really this time of year that is a gold mine for the bad guys. I mean, the bad guys get someone's tax return information and they have everything they need to go create a fake identity, and then they also have all this information about that person, about where they work and where their spouses work and income, things like that. They can use that information to further spoof that identity for other types of attacks as well. So tax fraud and spoofing a known entity in this area is just a gold mine this type of year for the bad guys. So let's go talk a little bit about email authentication. As Jeff mentioned, there's two basic standards that are out there about email authentication. They're called SPF and DKIM. These standards have been around for over 10 years and with varying levels of adoption in the industry, and they protect the message, they authenticate a message in different ways, so they're complementary standards. So every brand that is sending email on the internet should be doing both forms of authentication. But what really brings them together is a more recent standard called DMARC that was just released in 2012. And what DMARC does is it uses those two longer standing authentication messages to allow a sender to tell the world that I authenticate all of my email, and here's my policy for what I would like you to do with unauthenticated email, pretending it's my brand. And you can say if you get authenticated email or unauthenticated email from my brand, please reject it, or please send it to the quarantine, or do nothing but just send me reports about it. So that's the other aspect of DMARC, is it provides this previously unattainable reporting and visibility into your email flow as to how the rest of the world sees your email. So you reports back every day about, here's the email that went to Google for my brand, or went to Yahoo for my brand, and here's everything that passed authentication, everything that failed authentication, and where it all came from. So next slide, I believe we have some statistics on the adoption of these standards in the different categories that are tracked by the honor roll. And I've been looking at the honor roll and participating with OTA in this project for many years, and it's been great to see in some of these sectors that have been tracked for many years, see the adoption of these authentication standards grow. But as you can see from this chart, in every area we're not there yet. I mean, really, the goal should be for every email that's sent on the internet to be fully authenticated and sent with a DMARC record that says reject messages from this domain if it's not authenticated. In the eFile category that we're talking about right now, SPF and DKIM are both at about 62% for the underlying authentication standards, which is not great, but it's not the worst, but compared to some of the longer standing sectors like that have been doing email for a long time and involved in this authentication area, like social networks, for example, it's lagging pretty far behind. And really, I mean, what's more important to you as a consumer, to have your social media email, your Facebook notifications authenticated, or your tax return email authenticated? I think most of us would prefer to have our tax return email authenticated. And then we go down to the DMARC policies, and that's where we really need to see all sectors pick up the pace where they can actually definitively say, my email is authenticated, I want you to reject email that comes from my domain that's not authenticated. And one more point on this slide is in the honor roll we track whether you have SPF for any domain for your brand or your top-level domain, and top-level domain in this context being your primary brand domain, like probably the domain that's used for your website. And a lot of organizations overlook that because maybe they have their primary brand domain that they use for their website, but they don't send email from it. They use some subdomain that sends email for their marketing, another subdomain that sends it for transactional mail. But the criminals aren't limited in that way. The criminals can spoof any of your domains that they want. So even if you don't actively send email from your primary brand domain at the top level, that doesn't mean the criminals aren't going to spoof it. So you should still authenticate that domain and tell the world that you don't send email from it. Please reject unauthenticated email, which by definition would be all email from that domain in that case.
Hey, Mike, this is Craig. If I could interject for a second. So it's interesting you point out DMARC, which is relatively positive at 38% compared to the others, but
Hmm.
it's relying on SPF and DKIM. And what's interesting, if you compare at 62%, considerably lower adoption against the social sites or even internet retailer sites. So it's great to have a DMARC record, but if you're not using both SPF and DKIM, um, your level of protection is limited. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, there's a couple different levels of DMARC as well. So the 38% is any DMARC record, which means probably a monitor record. So the DMARC monitor record is great to start getting the visibility and reporting as to what's happening with your email out there. And it's the first step for any domain that is trying to implement DMARC. You always want to look at the data first. But to really get the protection, you have to go down to that next level where you have a reject or quarantine policy. But you're right. You definitely should be doing both SPF and DKIM absolutely before you move to that reject or quarantine policy. Now, you could actually get started with a DMARC monitor record before you have fully implemented SPF and DKIM, because that data that you get back from your DMARC monitor record is actually going to help you finish authenticating all of the email, all the legitimate email from your brand, because you'll have more visibility into what's failing.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Well, this is Jeff again. Just give an overview now of the site security category. So as in the consumer protection category, the baseline points are there in gray, and they primarily are driven by server and SSL or TLS implementation. And the primary tool that we've used to assess this is something called SSL Labs, and there's a site out there. It's referenced in our report, which gives you a letter grade. And we kind of map that along with some other of our own information into a numerical score that gives you your 100 baseline points. Bonus points are available in this category for extended validation certificates. That's where you get the green browser bar, and you'll see a little more of that later. For always-on SSL, so that's where from the very start of the session, the session is encrypted, or HTTPS, as you would see in your browser bar. And then penalty points for vulnerabilities if we find malware or malicious links, or if you're at risk for bot attacks. So that's kind of the overview of this category in terms of scoring. And what we're looking for is just basic site security practices that would be easily seen by any attacker. So one of the things I wanted to point out here is this is a screenshot from our the Qualys SSL Labs tool that I talked about. In this case, and this is one of the sites that we audited in this audit, they got a C. And you would say, well, that's an average score and it should roll in. But in our methodology, we're kind of looking at the weakest link is what you need to look at. That's why if you fail one of our categories, like consumer protection, site security, or privacy, you fail the overall honor roll. Well, in this case, you get a C according to their methodology, but you can see that the protocol support here, the line in yellow, the second one down, is a 50 or below 50, which means that that's essentially such a vulnerability that you're failing that component of this category. And so we map that to a failure. So I just wanted to make that clear if someone's kind of going out and assessing, well, a C seems okay, it sounds average. Well, we're kind of looking at what's the weakest link. And in this case, it's a failure. You'll see other sites that might score a C where it's because they have average scores that are all in the 70s, for instance. But in this case, there's a failure. And because of that vulnerability, we drive it to a failure. Then one other point, and then I'll turn it over to Flavio or Jeff to make some comments on this whole issue. This is a screenshot from a site that was also in the audit, and you can see it looks kind of wrong that their scores on the green bars are so high. They're all 90 or higher, and yet they have an F. And this is due to a recent vulnerability that has been detected. This was not a screenshot we took during our audit. This was done just a few days ago. But it makes the point that there are new vulnerabilities coming out all the time. And even though you might look like you have your act together, a new vulnerability can cause a failure because your site is now vulnerable to something that criminals have access to. And with some reconfiguration, this could be turned very quickly into an A. You can see the scores here in the green bars that all the basics are solid there. So we recommend constant monitoring of sites for that reason, that this week or next month might be very different than we saw just a few weeks ago. And this is a prime example of that. Flavia, I know you had some comments about kind of maintaining configuration and keeping pace with your site security.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. One of the things I find interesting is that many times in organizations that we work with, a lot of the technical people involved in managing security within those organizations feel very comfortable with the process of getting certificates installed, and I think too many times we feel too safe and just thinking that a certificate is enough. But in these two examples, you see these are both sites that are implementing very strong SSL online, but at the same time, if we aren't approaching security from a holistic standpoint, we're still leaving not only our organizations but also our user base and our user communities vulnerable to identity theft and other data leakage that could take place. For example, in this case here, as Jeff mentioned, even after the audit, this specific vulnerability, the drown attack, is something that was announced just within the last 2 weeks. And so there are many organizations out there, many different sites that have free utilities. We're not talking about things that organizations have to spend a lot of additional resources in obtaining extra tools or anything like that. Free services that are out there that enable administrators to continually check. And then some organizations also even provide continuous monitoring, proactive monitoring on behalf of organizations, and then notify anytime a new vulnerability is identified by the security community, and it gives administrators a chance to go in and update those security settings on servers. Most of the time I see these changes that need to take place within security settings aren't anything that costs any additional money. I mean, we're talking about changing specific settings and configurations. We're talking about things that in a matter of just a few minutes, and a capable administrator can go in and change, and you'll change a site's grade from an F from a security standpoint to an A. So these are things that are very easy to implement, but it's a matter of staying on top of what's going on. And it's something that should be part of internal organizations' of policies on having constant reviews of security best practices.
Great, that was helpful. Jeff, do you want to kind of talk a little bit about the EV side, the certificate side, and the importance of that from the trust standpoint?
Yeah, so this is Jeff Noakes with Symantec. EV-SSL is by far the most thorough of the authentication techniques that any of the certificate authorities use to vet the identity of web servers. It has been standardized by the CA Browser Forum, and it is very well adopted throughout most of the industry. EV has a special connotation here because I think it was in about 2010 or so is when the IRS essentially said, companies that do e-filing of tax records must use EV-SSL. So in that way, the IRS was ahead of most of the industry here. EV essentially is visible to the users through the the green bar, and all of the browsers support this. You will, whether, IE, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, you name it. And in addition to seeing that the green color, you can also see who is the certificate authority behind that SSL certificate.
Great, Jeff. That's helpful on there. And as you mentioned, that the IRS sat down with the industry in, I believe it was 2009. I know in some of the meetings I was in, and this whole idea was to help address that problem we talked about at the beginning, the look-alike domains out there, the bogus eFile sites that scrape content, and you actually could submit your tax return. And unbeknown to the consumer, you submitted it, and it was submitted for you, but ultimately they changed your bank routing and information to get your tax return or your refunds. So I think, again, EV is a good industry standard, and we're happy to see the IRS mandating that for all eFile organizations.
Yeah, and this is possibly a point where the infrastructure security, right, the SSL aspects of what the OTA recommends intersects with the brand protection aspects of, like DMARC and authenticated mail. Is in the OTA's report, there are some 400 lookalike domains that were registered in just 1 month between January and February of this year, I believe. And I think it's fair to say that these domain owners are looking to create domains that look suspiciously like the domains of the legitimate companies that are a part of the Free File Alliance. And so not only do they want to get at the individual filers' most private tax records and all the information that goes along with them, they essentially want to corrupt those brands, right, and start phishing to those the legitimate eFile agencies' users from a phisher's domain or a cybercriminal's domain, and essentially, take over that business and taint it for a very long time.
Well, great. Well, this slide here, and Jeff and Flavio, both of you maybe can comment on here, is kind of tracking the adoption. And again, on the eFile side, EV SSL at 92%. It should be at 100%. I should give you kind of a spoiler alert, is since we identified this and reached out to all these companies, the one company that was not in compliance has since adopted it, and as of, I believe, just 3 days ago or a week ago, has put an EV certificate up there. But perhaps both of you could kind of talk about always on SSL and why that's so important, and consider the sensitivity of this data, and especially comparing it to the banking industry, the FDIC segment.
Yeah, this is Flavio with DigiCert. And one of the things I found interesting, I think it's fantastic to see a number, 92%, and even with some of the changes, this specific subset of the Alliance members are nearing 100% adoption of EV, which is fantastic to give those users that identity assurance when they hit that website to submit their private financial information for tax purposes. But one of the things that you're leaving exposed is persisting that secure connection. So always on SSL means just that. SSL stays on during the entire visit of the user. And if you don't persist the security of that connection with the website, especially in the sense that you're transmitting sensitive financial and personal information back and forth between the user's computer and the server of the website operator, you really leave information that potentially could be exposed during that back and forth that could potentially be misused by someone eavesdropping on that connection.
Yeah, I think, and to underscore that, one thing we have given recommendation that the IRS require this for all e-file sites as a mandatory, which would be consistent with the White House and OMB directive that government sites that are handling data move to this. So the always on SSL is out there. Most of your social sites have gone up there. You're starting to see more of that in some of the areas as well, your Facebooks and Twitters and such. But the banks have recognized this. So we would expect this, and we're looking at increasing the weight in our honor roll this summer to increase the weighting on this, and we would expect a year from now this will be a mandatory and could be a reason to automatically fail a site because the sensitivity of the data and the amount of packet sniffing that is occurring out there. So good insights here, and we can come back and certainly questions coming up during the Q&A here. But I think, again, these are industry standards that are relatively inexpensive or at no cost. The same thing in the web app firewall. Interesting, very low level in the eFile, which actually opens up the risk of bots and other things of bot attacks against those sites and filing bogus returns. So concerns that we have in these areas here. So I'm going to jump on the privacy area, the third leg of the stool, so to speak here. And again, consistent with what Jeff has shared is we have baseline points. We score the privacy policy. The privacy policy is scored based on the practices of data sharing, practices of data usage, as well as retention, as well as do not track part of that disclosure. And do not track is an industry standard mandate by state of California, becoming a benchmark requirement in the EU as well. So again, that's respecting a user's request. And so this is not necessarily the data that is being submitted on the tax forms. What's concerning, we'll get into, is what the sites are collecting of visitors that are being directed to them from the IRS and how that data is being used. We also look at bonus points on how the privacy policy is written. And this is a good example of compliance versus stewardship. In general, privacy policies are written for the company by their attorneys to protect the company. They are not to provide clear and concise disclosures. The FTC, as well as the FCC, has been very vocal about privacy policies, how they need to be done better to really inform consumers. So we look at bonus points in these areas, which we'll give some examples of use of icons, layered policies, as well as sites that actually honor a do not track. And then we, as Jeff mentioned, we also have bonus points and we have penalty points. So sites that had a data breach, whether it was their fault or not, receive negative score and points here. It doesn't keep you from making the honor roll. If you have an FTC settlement, that goes into things as well. Again, a lot of companies have FTC and state settlements here, but it's this combined scoring that we look at. So let's really look at what we see here. So on the surface, again, we look at layered policies, and this would be basically the policy where it says read here for our position on sharing data, or we don't share data. So how many and what percent? So 23% of eFile companies, that's good on the surface, but concerning the sensitivity of data. Only a few of them have, only one of them have icons. What's perhaps most surprising is none of them had a privacy policy that was multilingual. And so we look at that, the presidential candidates recognizing that they want money from people have recognized the need there. So that's a low-hanging fruit opportunity on there. And then do not track disclosures are very disappointing at 8% here. So while the eFile sites didn't fail to privacy, it was concerning and remains concerning and suggests a need for oversight because the data mining and sharing that's going on, the retargeting, and again, part of the problem is you go to the IRS site, they give you this direct link to these other sites you go to. It's not an expected that this data collection would be going on. If it was going to a news or media site that relies on advertising, you would. So it was unexpected and concerning, and this is an area that we'd be calling for actually a code of conduct by the eFile Alliance to really take a higher level here of really what's going on here. So I do want to share an example of layered notices and icons. This is an example, one of our OTA members, Publishers Clearinghouse. I think everyone's pretty familiar about who they are out there. But what they've actually did is they went from a 4,000 word privacy policy down to 475. So this is what's called a layered short notice. They have icons in here, and the whole idea for their perspective is they want to provide clarity, transparency, and readability. So this is something that, again, we would like to see going forward because against the sensitivity. And this is something we'd certainly be willing to provide additional recommendations to and work with anyone in the industry in these areas. So a tremendous opportunity for anyone. And by the way, this goes not for only federal filing, but also for state filing. So what's occurring on that site and what's the expected activity from the consumer perspective. So, as a summary, we believe that this sector lags in many sectors in transparency and discoverability. As you go to the IRS site, I think all the pages are available in Spanish. And so, again, we're not suggesting the sites be localized, but if you're trying to communicate complex terms and issues, we believe it should be in someone's native language. And clearly, Spanish is a very high one. We do that on our own site here. And again, my point about the data collection that appears to be going on and the tracking and the retargeting. And the last point is only one of them provided a do not track disclosure, which is stipulated by California state law. So again, that could, moving forward, be an automatic failure going forward. These are simple things to do. And I would say the counter of the do not track might be, we understand and we don't honor a do not track signal. That's okay. That's a disclosure the site makes. But it's concerning, again, that we have such a low level of support, and it appears to be perhaps lack of awareness and such of these issues. So part of our goal is to raise these awareness to all these areas. I do want to come back to the IRS mandates here, and Jeff and everyone can jump in here. So the IRS in 2009, I believe, developed some mandates that went in effect at the end of 2010, which IRS said they would be enforcing. And these are 4 areas that we were able to measure. EV-SSL, so up to us flagging this issue, it was only 92%. Challenge response for filing, and this is a CAPTCHA, or is one of the tactics on there. So this whole idea to counter the bots. So just shy of 40%. Privacy seal, and part of the point of a privacy seal is one that actually audits the practices. So one of the site has an alternative seal, but they don't do any auditing of their practice on there. It's basically a self-assertion. So we feel that site's also out of compliance. Now, these factors by themselves did not lead to our failing, again, because we were using a consistent methodology. If we did apply these and added attributes, you would have a higher increase in failures. Again, in this case, because of lack of compliance with the IRS security mandates that they put forth in 2010. And by the way, they were updated and clarified in April, I believe, or May of 2015. A few other areas to point here that we also think is really lacking here is 2-factor or multi-factor authentication. We think the security standards and mandates that are being used are inadequate. They talk about strength of passwords, and we all know from the industry standpoint, it's not the number of characters that are put in there. It's multi-factor authentication, and just 3 weeks ago, the OMB and the White House issued recommendations on that area there. So this is another area that we'd be expecting trade organizations to operate in the interest of consumers here and adopt such protocols and processes in these areas. So I'm going to hand it back to Jeff here, and Jeff, maybe you can kind of, before we go to Q&A, what have we observed in this past week?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Historically, we do not go back and rescore our audits. As mentioned, they're a snapshot of a point in time. There's a lot of work that goes into pulling together all the data, so rescoring it on a regular basis is not realistic. But in this case, with a small set of companies and with the attention that's been on this, we've gone back and looked at some of the key failure areas to see what's happened since we announced the results and reached out to these companies. And there have been positive moves, and so we wanted to point that out, that several sites have stepped up to the plate here. So in the email authentication area, there were 5 companies who failed, 4 who had no email authentication at all of any kind. The 4 sites that had none have all added SPF records, which is kind of your entry-level baseline. Although one of them, the syntax that they use makes it an invalid record, but the attempt was there in all 4 sites, which is great. The 3 that had valid SPF records also added a DMARC record, so they can start monitoring their authentication and get reports back, as Mike had mentioned. The 5th failing site had made no changes at all, but 3 of those sites now, because of their addition of SPF and DMARC, would now qualify to make the honor roll. That's how binary this can be when you go from nothing to having sufficient protection in that consumer protection area. In the site security area, of the 3 failing sites, 1 has improved to an A- by updating their configuration. 1 hasn't changed at all from what we can tell, and the other one made improvements, but they still fail for some other reasons. And so, again, this is kind of an emphasis that these changes, since they've been done just in the last few weeks, are very straightforward to make, mostly free of charge, just takes time and attention, and it kind of emphasizes the point that not only are these not difficult, but they also do need ongoing monitoring. Craig already pointed out that the 1 site that had no EV certificate now does, so they're at 100% compliance. But we have, as noted in the site security area, seen some new vulnerabilities since the audit. So all companies would be encouraged to kind of reassess themselves in the site security area, for instance, to keep pace with that. And maybe Flavio or Jeff or Mike, you guys can talk about maybe kind of ongoing monitoring and what are some best practices there to stay on top of things.
So this is Jeff from Symantec. You know, in terms of the best practices, one of the things that we are seeing with our customers, and we recommend, is that anytime an organization modifies anything having to do with security, that they just automatically run a test through the Qualys SSL Labs server testing tool. I'm certain that there's a link to that in the resources at the end of this. And it will test everything about that certificate and will report for free and will report back on what needs to be fixed, right? The remediation that the site needs to take. And it is sometimes when people, you know, as Jeff said earlier, all of these things are sort of straightforward settings and configurations, but sometimes mistakes are made. And this tool picks them up and allows you to fix them before they become a problem.
Great. Maddie, back to you.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I want to thank Jeff Noakes and Flavio Martins and Mike Jones, and of course Craig and Jeff from OTA for a great presentation. I did get some questions while we were going through, so I'm going to start shooting these back to you. I've kind of grouped them a little bit. So I want to start with questions that have to do with email authentication. And Jeff Wilbur, you touched on this a little bit at the end, but I'm going to direct this to Mike Jones, really, about just giving the audience some advice about how difficult and expensive is it to implement the email authentication technologies that we've been talking about here. The comment came in the last end of the presentation that some companies have gone back and actually addressed some of these issues. But how would a company get started on this? Are the standards open? How difficult and expensive is it to implement email authentication?
Sure. Excuse me. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah. So I'll address I guess the expensive part first, because that's the easier part to answer. So the standards that email authentication are based on, SPF, DKIM, and then DMARC, are open standards. There are open source tools and packages out there that anyone can use to implement these standards, things like Open DKIM, Open DMARC. So I think the bottom line answer to the expensive question is it's actually the actual technology and method to do it is free. Now, it will obviously take some people in your organization's time to implement the changes, and if you're not already email authentication savvy, you'll have to learn about the standards and how to implement them. You certainly don't want to do it wrong. So there is that factor, which obviously is a cost to, but you don't have to buy software necessarily to implement any of these authentication standards. And if you need help, of course, there are services out there that have businesses to help. On the difficulty question, I think the level of difficulty varies, and there's difficulty in different ways. So I think in general the standards aren't hard to understand, and most companies who have email folks get it pretty quickly, as is evidenced by the fact that some of the companies in this survey have already implemented at least some of the standards from the time that the honor roll went out until this webinar. So you can see there that's a pretty quick turnaround. A lot of companies, though, the difficulty comes in figuring out what are the actual sources of my email. So this really gets into how do I fully authenticate my email, and then they have to go out and use that data that they're getting from DMARC to figure everything out. Like most companies use a lot of different third parties to send email and such, and you have to understand all of those sources and figure out how to work with your third parties to authenticate them. So some of those process things are the more difficult part than actually the technology of authenticating email.
Well, thank you. I have one follow-up question related also to email. Is the kind of the downside of this is there a danger that my legitimate email will be blocked, or what's the risk of false positives as I implement these?
Yeah, that's always when you're talking about blocking email, there's always the question about, well, what about blocking the real stuff? So of course, I mean, you can't block email without a risk of blocking legitimate email. But then again, that's why part of the reason why DMARC came to be implemented the way it was to help companies mitigate that risk of blocking legitimate email. So you get the visibility of what's happening out there sent back to you every day, or even closer to real time for some of the reporting, where you can see what's actually happening. So if you have a reject policy and something goes wrong and your legitimate mail starts failing authentication for some reason, you will see that in the reports that you get back so that you can fix it. And that kind of goes to the point Jeff Wilbur was making at the end of the talk about ongoing monitoring. So from the email authentication side, that ongoing, you're basically never done monitoring your email authentication. So even once you get all the way to DMARC reject, you want to keep getting those reports, keep monitoring it so that you know if something goes wrong, so that you don't actually block any of your legitimate stuff.
Great, thank you. Before we run out of time, I want to jump to some of the security questions. I got one here that was about the process of, actually it's more of a technical question about the SHA-1 versus SHA-2 and the secure hash algorithm. There was an issue about how hard is it to fix this, what should people be doing, what server changes are needed. So on the security and certificate side, we have Jeff Noakes and Flavio Martins. Jeff, do you want to comment?
Sure. So this migration of SHA-1 or the deprecation of SHA-1 and moving to SHA-2 has been underway for some time now, and almost everybody has already done this. I know for certain that at Symantec we provide these replacement certificates, SHA-2 certificates, for free. So, which is something that Jeff Wilbur said earlier, that many of these changes are just configuration changes, and almost all of these things are free, and they just take a little bit of time and attention to get them done. If anybody visits, does a Google for SHA-1 hash algorithm migration, they will be taken to a semantic site that provides step-by-step guidance on this about what needs to be done to your web server, which is not much. And then, of course, there is the free testing tool that after you've done that and before you roll it out, you can run it through the test tool, and you can see how that implementation was correctly done, or if it needs another tweak.
Thanks. And I'm going to direct this one to Flavio. It's also a security question, but it is more of a general question about what should I be thinking about and how would I approach moving toward always-on SSL. That was one of the bonus areas in this analysis, and how should I be thinking about doing that in my own site?
Well, I would say, number one, if you're considering whether or not to do it, obviously look at, Craig mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that the honor roll criteria that are used are coming from already published standards that have been accepted by different industries and different authorities as best practices. And so look to that as to hopefully be able to answer your question, should you do it? Absolutely, because that is considered an industry best practice in order to do it. As far as doing it, I think a similar thing, if you look at what Jeff mentioned, is that there are migration guides out there similar to SHA-1 that Symantec has done. DigiCert's done the same thing on the SHA-2 migration. Same thing on enabling always-on SSL. Search for always-on SSL migration or always-on SSL enable, and there are guides out there that are published by the major certificate authorities like DigiCert, Symantec, and others. One of the things that I know my colleagues at Symantec and my colleagues here at DigiCert, we've been working together with the CA Browser Forum, trying to create initiatives to make it easier to implement better security across the board. So not only on that persisting SSL through user sessions, but also in other initiatives like SHA-2 and ensuring that as new vulnerabilities are identified by the research community, that our customers, well, whether customers or not, because these resources are available to anyone out there, customer or non-customer, that everyone benefits from that new information and that security can be deployed everywhere.
Great. This is Craig. I just want to add to that on the case of the SHA-1 versus SHA-2. I believe it was NIST issued an advisory that said all companies must update their certificates by January 2015 as SHA-2. So it's a good example that this information has been out there. So it's somewhat hard to understand if it's a free thing to do. All the certificate authorities provide it, why companies aren't. And it really, I think, underscores the complexity and people really managing it. And just see that all these things require diligence, because the whole idea is that these are issues that are responding to known threats and vulnerabilities out there. And I guess to sum it up, as we know that attack sites, tax filers are really increasingly being targeted, that more than ever we need to double down our investments on these security basics and adopt them, be the leading edge. And so it would be our hope at OTA that we'd actually see a year from now these eFile companies actually significantly move beyond the compliance requirements to a much higher level and hitting the ball out of the park, because as demonstrated, these are easy to do and they have tremendous consumer value today.
Great. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I am going to take a moment again to thank Jeff Noakes of Symantec, Flavio Martins of DigiCert, Mike Jones of Agari, Craig Spiesel, and Jeff Wilbur of the Online Trust Alliance. And thank you everyone in the audience for attending. It's been great. I want to point you to the resource slide that's up there. The Online Trust Alliance has a website with a great deal of resources and tools and advice, but particularly on this topic, the free eFile tax site audit is available. There are some other examples of the use of the honor roll in the case of the presidential candidate audit or last year's online trust honor roll. We'll be doing the new one for 2016 coming up here in the spring. We also encourage you to consider some of our other topics like the IoT working group. We have an email integrity and security working group, and email integrity audit is another publication